Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting event our Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia University is organizing. My name is Tun Shan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History and also the Deputy Director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center. It is our distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's special panel, where we are lucky to host three distinguished guests, Dr. Yusuf Ben Ismail, Dr. Mohammed Waldi, and Professor Julia Clancy-Smith. I'll give the floor in a minute to my esteemed colleague and Sakıp Sabancı visiting professor of Turkish Studies, Professor Zeynep Çelik, to introduce our guests. But before doing that, let me express our gratitude to Sakıp Sabancı family for their support to promote Ottoman and Turkish studies related events here in New York and beyond. I should also thank Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, Paris, and Tunis for co-sponsoring today's panel. And many thanks, as usual, to Ararat Şekeryan, our center's program manager, for his logistical support. So without further ado, I'm now turning to Professor Zeynep Çelik to give introduction to our guests today.
Thank you, Tunç, and welcome to all. We are very pleased to hold a discussion on Tunisia during the Ottoman period, a somehow marginalized topic among Ottoman historians until quite recently, but no more. Let me introduce our impressive speakers and thank them for accepting our invitation. Yusuf Ben Ismail is a historian of the Ottoman Mediterranean with a focus on North Africa from 1700 to 1900. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 2021. He is an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows for the Humanities at Columbia University. It's a mouthful, the institution, but there he is. He is now here at Columbia, and he lectures in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, and in the Department of History. Dr. Ben Ismail's research deals with law and empire in the 19th century Mediterranean. He's currently writing a book on the French-Ottoman imperial rivalry over the sovereign status of Tunis after the 1830 conquest of Algiers. He's a research collaborator in a European Research Center project which explores Ottoman janissary networks in the early modern port cities around the Mediterranean. Before joining Columbia, Yusuf taught at Harvard and the University of Tunis. His topic today is Subjects of the Sultan, Subjects of the Bey, Provincial Autonomy and Legal Belonging. Mehmet Waladi is a historian of early modern and modern North Africa and professor at Sciences Po Paris. He has worked on two main areas: the many effects of transitioning from the Ottoman rule to a French colonial domination in North African societies, and slavery and its social impacts in the 18th and 19th century Mediterranean. Professor Waldi is the author of two monographs, Esclaves et Maîtres, les Mamelouks au service des beys de Tunis du XVIIe siècle aux années 1880, 1880, and this came out in 2011, and A Slave Between Empires, 2020. His current research project, funded by a European Research Center grant — what would we do without the European Research Center? I don't know. Well, his current research project, funded by ERC, deals with the narratives and ego documents by enslaved North Africans in Europe and by European, African, and Caucasian slaves in 18th and 19th century North Africa. His talk today is titled Over Tunisian Dead Bodies, Ottoman Burial Politics in the 1880s. Julia Clancy-Smith will offer her comments and reflections on the two presentations. She obtained her PhD from UCLA in 1988 and is currently Regent Professor of History at the University of Arizona. She recently received a Guggenheim Fellowship to complete a monograph on schooling, education, and gender in colonial North Africa. Clancy Smith authored Mediterraneans, North Africa and Europe in the Age of Migration, 1800-1900. This book came out in 2012. And Rebel and Saint, Muslim Notables, Populist Protests, Colonial Encounters, 1994. She has many chapters in edited volumes, most recently one titled The Mediterranean of the Barbary Coast Gone Missing, in the Making of the Modern Mediterranean, Views from the South, edited by Judith Tucker, 2019. Her occasional paper, Tunisian Revolutions, Reflections on Seas, Coasts, and Interiors, 2014, examines the Arab uprisings from a longue durée Mediterranean perspective. In addition, she co-edited Walls of Algiers, Narrative of the City in Text and Image, 2009, and that was with me, as well as Domesticating the Empire, Languages of Gender, Race, and Family Life in French and Dutch Colonialism, 1830-1962, and this book came out in 1998. Clancy Smith co-authored a textbook, The Middle East and North Africa, A History in Documents, 2014. She is in the process of completing a multi-authored text, North Africa from Carthage to the Arab Spring, 2023, forthcoming. Thank you very much. Let's pass the word on to our speakers now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers really for this wonderful, wonderful event. I think it's the first time that an Ottoman Tunis event of this sort is organized, to my knowledge, in US academia. And so I think that's an important step. So thank you very much to Professor Zeynep Çelik, to Professor Tun Shan, and to Ararat Shekerian as well for putting together this panel. I want to also thank my co-panelists, of course, Julia Clancy Smith and Hamed Weldi, whose work I've admired for a long time. To those who are in attendance, I want to thank you in advance, because this is research that is part of my book project, and it's the first time that I get to present this particular chunk of it. So that's particularly exciting for me. So with that, I'm going to share my screen for us to have a PowerPoint. Okay. Can everybody see the PowerPoints? Wonderful.
Youssef, we see your text as well.
Okay. Let me fix that.
It's done now.
Let me try again, just to make sure. Can you see the text now?
No, just the PowerPoint.
Okay, that feels like a more fitting arrangement. So in 1874, the Tunisian government issued a new regulation providing a legal framework for the status of Algerians on its territory. This regulation was designed to curtail the spread of French consular protection among Algerian residents in Tunis. Since the French colonization of Algiers in 1830, Algerians established in neighboring Tunis, and there were thousands of them, claimed extraterritorial rights on the basis of their new status as French protégés. For the Tunisian government, this was an infringement on local authority. Algerians in Tunisia were not allowed to evade local jurisdiction. They had been living in Tunis for so long that they were no longer considered as foreigners in the eyes of the local government. But if they weren't foreign nationals, and if they weren't French protégés, then what were they? This 1874 regulation assumed the existence of a category of legal subjecthood that was specific to quote unquote local Tunisians. And so interestingly, the campaign against French consular protection, which culminated with the 1874 regulation, forced the Tunisian state to provide one of the earliest explicit definitions of what it means to be Tunisian. In the next 20 minutes or so, I want to begin to examine Tunisian categories of subjecthood on their own terms, as a form of bottom-up history of belonging that takes seriously legal political categories that do not originate in European legal traditions. In other words, how can we think about regimes of belonging and subjecthood without recourse to the European archetypes of nationality and citizenship? How did the Tunisian government understand the legal bond that linked the Tunisian state to its population? And most importantly, for our purposes, how did this understanding square with the Ottoman theory of provincial governance in Tunis? And ultimately, what emerges from this bottom-up exploration is a complex view of what it meant to be Tunisian, a view that befits Tunis's particular sovereignty arrangement within the Ottoman imperial context. In this context, several relational categories of subjecthood apply to the same population. The layered nature of what it meant to be Tunisian, along with the inadequateness, if you will, of nationality as a term to designate it, should, in my opinion, alert historians to the need to decenter the European conceptual apparatus of international law. Instead, we need to think about what a Tunisian conception of Tunisian subjecthood looks like, and perhaps more importantly, what an Ottoman conception of Ottoman subjecthood looked like. Okay, so back to the text. The 1874 regulation described the status of Algerians in Tunis in the following terms. I'll just read this little quote that you have on the slide. Among the Algerians who are established in the province of Tunis, there is a segment that is under the protection, himaya, of the Tunisian state. Another one that remains under the himaya of the French state, and a third group who seeks to be under the authority of both states, such as if they risk being prosecuted by either state, they claim to be under the himaya of the other. To remedy this problem, those who are protected, muhtam, by the Tunisian state, or seek to be protected, al-ihtima, by it, must sign up on a special registry, and it shall be announced publicly that those who seek to enter under the protection of the Tunisian states must register in this way. Now, in the secondary literature, the concept of himaya in Arabic, himaye in Ottoman Turkish, as it appears repeatedly in this regulation, has systematically been translated as nationality, and because this literature is usually in French as nationalité. Today, nationality has become a universal category of belonging. As a result, the act of translating himaya, which literally means protection, as nationalité seems harmless in a way, because nationality appears to us as an empty shell of sorts, a generic and mostly descriptive concept. But the question here is, what if we refrain from translating himaya and consider it on its own terms, right? And in order to begin addressing this question, it's useful to compare the original published version of the 1874 regulation with another version, here shown on the right, or on the left part of the screen. And this was a handwritten draft, a copy, a nuskha of the original regulation, signed by the hand of Khaireddin Tunsi. Some of you might know him as Tunuslu Khaireddin Pasha, the Tunisian prime minister who would later go on to become Grand Vizier in Istanbul in 1878, a few years later. And this copy is located in a file of the French consular archives, which contains the letters received by the French consulate from the Tunisian government for that year, 1874, suggesting that Khaireddin himself probably sent the hand copy to the French consul, and probably to inform him that the Tunisian government would no longer allow Algerians to claim the status of French protégé, right? And the excerpt that you see here is from the same passage that I quoted earlier, only as it appears in the handwritten copy rather than the official printed one. I'm not going to read it again, but as you can see, quite strikingly, although this copy was identical in every way to the official version of the regulation, each time the legal status of Algerians in Tunis is mentioned, the term jenseya is used instead of himaya. In other words, while Khaireddin referred to the Tunisian regime of legal subjecthood or of legal belonging as himaya in the official version, the one that circulated in Tunis, he replaced it with the term jenseya in the copy he sent to the French consulate. Now, this replacement, quote unquote, is particularly intriguing to me, given that it was the only difference between the original and the copy. And very quickly here, what you see is on the original on the left, right, the parts of the text that are underlined in red indicate places where himaya was replaced by jenseya in the copy sent to the consul. The dotted line points to places where himaya was absent, but jenseya was nevertheless added in the handwritten text. And finally, the parts underlined in blue designate places where himaya appears in the original but was removed in the copy. On the right side of the slide, in the handwritten copy, on the other hand, jenseya is highlighted each time it appears in reference to Tunisians. So given the systematic nature of these edits, it seems unlikely that himaya's replacement with jenseya was accidental. Instead, it really suggests that Khaireddin's actions were deliberate, that they were systematic. He made sure to avoid using jenseya in the original copy and actively resorted to it rather than to himaya in the version addressed to the French consul. So naturally, the question is, what is jenseya and how did it differ from himaya as a modality of legal subject? Well, fortunately for us, the legal genealogy of jenseya is much better documented than that of himaya. So we know more about its meaning. Beginning in the late 19th century, we know that jenseya emerged as the Arabic term for nationality. In Tunis, although it was seldom used before 1914, which is when it was introduced in French colonial law, the term jenseya does appear in official texts on a number of occasions in the 1860s and the 1870s. It was, for instance, featured in the text of the Qanun al-Dawla, a set of legal and administrative reforms proclaimed by the Bey of Tunis in 1861. You have a printed copy of it here on the screen. So Article 106 of the Qanun al-Dawla, for instance, stated that, and I quote, all those under the jurisdiction of European state will not be troubled in the practice of their religion, and their decision to change religion does not strip them of their jenseya, of their nationality. 10 years later, in 1878, a Tunisian statesman, Hussein ibn Abdullah, whose afterlife Hamid Weldi will examine in his talk today, wrote a legal pamphlet arguing in favor of the Tunisian nationality, of the Tunisian jenseya of Nassim Shmama, a man who died in Italy. The point here is that in 1874, when Khaireddin's regulation made use of the term, it was already relatively established that jenseya referred to the concept of nationality. All of these early uses of jenseya in the 1860s and the 1870s share an important characteristic, though. They all involve European interlocutors. In many ways, Hussein's pamphlet on the jenseya of Shmama was a European text. It was written in Tuscany for an audience of European lawyers and in the context of a legal battle held in Italian courtrooms. the text was translated into French the very year of its publication. As for Khaireddin and the 1874 regulation, Khaireddin only used the term Tunisian jenseya when addressing the French consul in a private correspondence, making sure the phrase was entirely absent from the official version of the anti-protection regulation. As for, on the other hand, Article 106 of the Qanun al-Dawla, which mentioned jenseya in reference to the nationality of Europeans, was the only one of the Qanun's 114 articles where the term was used. All other references, and there were many, to Tunisian legal subjecthood used different terms. And in this regard, the parallel with Article 94, and you have both versions on the right of the same text, right, is quite striking. Article 94 and Article 106 are nearly identical. Article 94 also intimated that a change of religion does not apply, or rather imply, a change in legal subjecthood, except that it concerned Tunisians rather than Europeans. And crucially, it states that, and I quote, if non-Muslim Tunisian convert to another religion, their conversion will not strip them of Tunisian himaya. So this evidence suggests that while himaya and jenseya seem to have been considered more or less equivalent, they were certainly not interchangeable terms. More specifically, in the second half of the 19th century, jenseya seems to have been considered unfit for use in official legal texts describing the regime of legal subjecthood linking Tunisians to the Tunisian state. Only when referring to European subjecthood, or when discussing legal belonging with European interlocutors, was the term jenseya, it seems, deemed appropriate. And what this suggests in turn is that in late 19th century Tunisian, let's call it legal parlance, jenseya was a synonym for nationalité, understood as European or European style nationality. As such, it was considered distinct from local categories of legal belonging, such as himaya. Why then was European nationality unfit to describe the legal status of Tunisians vis-à-vis the Tunisian state? One explanation, poorly illustrated by this slide, is that Tunisians perceive jenseya as an inherently European concept, and as such a concept applicable only to Europeans. The fact that the Qanun al-Dawla used jenseya only in reference to the legal status of Europeans suggests that Tunisians were aware of the diversity of legal categories of belonging and of their rootedness in different legal traditions. By the 20th century, nationality had acquired the universal and homogeneous quality it has today. In the 19th century, however, the legal categories binding individuals to their states varied depending on their legal cultural context. Europeans had nationality and jenseya, while Tunisians, Ottomans, and arguably other non-European states had their own categories, including himaya. Just like, for example, the Tunisians and the Ottomans had a system of law predicated on Sharia, and Europeans had other codified European systems of law. Different legal worlds, different legal cultures. When addressing Europeans, Tunisians could certainly refer to Tunisian nationality or to Tunisian jenseya, perhaps in an effort to make himaya or other categories more legible for their foreign interlocutors. But in a domestic setting, using the concept would be akin to adopting foreign law. However, I think a more crucial reason helps account for why European-style nationality was unfit for use in reference to Tunisian subjecthood. And the reason is that from the outset, nationality was inherently linked to the idea of state sovereignty. In the works of early European theorists, nationality designated the relationship between a population and a state that was necessarily sovereign. For instance, Georges Cogordon, who was the leading French legal theorists of nationality in the late 19th century defined it as the link that unites individual with the state that is supreme and independent. Elsewhere, he described the act of conferring nationality as, and I quote, an act of sovereignty par excellence. And similarly, in the works of all legal theorists in this period, right, over and over again, having nationals and conferring a nationalité appeared both as an attribute and as a prerogative of sovereign states and exclusively sovereign states. And Tunisian and Ottoman statesmen were certainly not blind to the nuances of these European legal concepts. In Tunis, nationalité, identified by the Arabic term jenseya, was seen for what it was, a legal category that belonged to the European context, where sovereign states had exclusive authority over those who find themselves under their jurisdiction. The fact that domestic legal texts all seem to carefully avoid the use of jenseya strongly suggests that the Bey and his government were aware of these complexities. In a sense, European belonging was unidimensional. It linked individuals to sovereign states. The sovereignty arrangement of the Tunisian state, however, was multidimensional, a situation that, as many of you know, was hardly unique to Tunis in the Ottoman context. Egypt, Algiers before 1830, Tripolitania, Montenegro, Moldavia, Wallachia, Samos, several other autonomous provinces and territories of the Ottoman realm all occupied a similar space within the imperial system. This was a space of layered sovereignty, of manifold authority, of overlapping jurisdiction. And in this context, conventional legal political vocabularies inherited from the European legal tradition seem inappropriate. As Ottoman subjects hailing from an autonomous province of the empire, Tunisians were under the full jurisdiction of the Bey's government. But this jurisdiction was legally sanctioned by the Ottoman government in Istanbul. It was understood as a function of the autonomy of Tunis within the Ottoman system of imperial governance. So as an autonomous but unambiguously Ottoman governor, the local authority of the Bey of Tunis was extensive and exclusive. Crucially, however, it was not of a sovereign nature, as sovereign authority over Tunis belonged to the Ottoman Sultan alone. And this sovereign authority, this Ottoman sovereign authority over Tunis was enshrined in an Ottoman Ferman, famously in 1871. As a result, given the sovereign implications of European nationalité, for the Tunisian government to assert the existence of a Tunisian jenseya would be the equivalent of declaring independence from the Ottoman Empire. On the other hand, while himaya also referred to a jurisdictional relationship between a population and a state, unlike jenseya, unlike nationality, it had no implication on the sovereignty status of the state in question. In fact, when the Bey of Tunis wrote to the Ottoman central government, which happened frequently, he often referred to Tunisians as muhtamis of the Tunisian state. So this himaya referred to the Bey's jurisdictional authority over Tunisians, but this authority was delegated to him by the Ottoman Sultan. As such, himaya was thus very much part of the legal vocabulary underlying Ottoman autonomous governance in Tunis. For the Bey of Tunis to claim that Tunisians were muhtamis of the Tunisian government thus constituted a way to assert his own legal authority while simultaneously inscribing it in an Ottoman imperial context. This relationship had nothing to do with sovereignty. On the contrary, himaya was one of the delegated duties incumbent upon the Bey of Tunis in virtue of his status as an autonomous provincial governor. And here, autonomy and provinciality are both very important concepts. In a way, the very fact that Tunisians were designated as muhtamis of the Bey invoked the Bey's duties as an Ottoman administrator. And so instead of national, citizen, or even subject, perhaps a more appropriate English translation for muhtami or mahmi would be constituent, in the sense of a body of people who are under the designated authority of an administration. In my opinion, an even better translation is provided by the French term administré, which literally means administered person, defined in one late 19th century French dictionary as a person who is under the public administrative authority. Tunisians were therefore at once Tunisian administrés and Ottoman subjects. And as I said in the introduction, this dual mode of subjecthood, whereby several relational categories of belonging apply to the same population, was the result of Tunis's particular sovereignty arrangement in the Ottoman imperial context. As an autonomous governor, the Bey's jurisdiction over Tunisian was absolute, but his autonomy was not conceived in opposition to Ottoman imperial sovereignty. Much like the status of Muhtami itself did not stand in contradiction to that of Ottoman national or subject. Now, today, nationality is almost considered a culturally neutral category. And I think this helps explain why historians are often tempted to project it back, right, on the pre-20th century categories of subjecthood. But in this very short talk, what I've tried to suggest is that using nationality as an ethic category of analysis really obfuscates its emic nature, right? One that is rooted in the European international legal tradition of the 19th century. And the challenge then is to avoid this trap by disabusing ourselves from the notion that European categories of legal belonging have always had a universal scope or applicability. In the context of Ottoman Tunis, concretely, rather than adopting nationality as a translation for himaya, one should instead view it as nationalité, right? A European concept, alongside himaya, two different, quote unquote, indigenous categories, each belonging to a different legal world, as it were. But the stakes surrounding this question, I think, go beyond a historian's concern for analytical precision. Unrigorous European translations of Ottoman Tunisian legal concepts lead to the erasure of the Ottoman tradition of imperial governance in Tunis, and I would argue in the empire's autonomous provinces more broadly. This tradition rested on a repertoire of legal and political concepts shared by elites in autonomous territories and in Istanbul. By translating himaya as nationality, historians invisibilize this repertoire and disengage it from the broader legal apparatus of Ottoman governance. On the other hand, understanding himaya on its own terms conveys the diversity of ways in which subjecthood was defined in the Ottoman 19th century. This diversity, in turn, reveals alternative genealogies of sovereignty, of autonomy, and of statehood, and locates them outside the purview of European legal and intellectual history. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yes, so I wanted to thank first the conveners of this meeting, Zainab Çelik and Tun Shan, but as well Arad. And as well, I wanted to thank Julia Canty-Smith for taking the time to discuss our two papers. And I'm pleased that, I'm not starting with the conclusion, sorry. I'm pleased that the Ottomanists are taking a look at the North Africanists. I always thought that we were seen as a strange tribe from North Africa, but I start my talk with the story of a box, a lead and zinc box, and on top of this box one reads the label antiques, and by mid-November 1887 this box was shipped from the French port of Marseille, that you know indeed, on a British steamer. And this box eventually arrived in Istanbul a few days later, by late November 1887. And the label antiques on top of the box is quite misleading, because the box did not contain at all any Greek nor Roman artifact, but the remains of Hussein bin Abdallah that Yusuf just mentioned in his paper. And Hussein bin Abdallah was a manumitted slave born in the southern borders of Russia in Circassia that you can see on the map. He was not indeed an usual slave, but he became the first mayor of the city of Tunis by the end of the 1850s, and he became as well the first kind of minister of education in the same Ottoman province of Tunis in the beginning of the 1870s. In Istanbul, Hussein's remains were to be buried in a specific place in the garden of Sultan Mahmud II's prestigious mausoleum. And this mausoleum, built in 1838, was renowned for housing not only the grave of its builder, Mahmud II, who implemented major reforms, but as well the gravestones of his successor, Sultan Abdulaziz and Sultan Abdulhamid. Prior to this last stop, in Sultan Mahmud II's mausoleum in Istanbul, two weeks earlier, Hussein's remains had first to be exhumed from a Muslim cemetery in Livorno, which was indeed a major Italian port located in Tuscany, and which was a major port in terms of trade between North Africa and mainly Tunisia and Europe. And Hussein settled in this region in Tuscany, in Livorno, in Florence for a decade. And there in Livorno, by 1887, the local Ottoman vice consul received a special order from the Sultan Abdulhamid II to send Hussein's remains. The very last travel of Hussein from Tuscany to the political center of the Ottoman Empire, and above all, the very fact that Hussein was finally buried in the mausoleum of Mahmud II is indeed intriguing and quite astonishing, because Hussein was indeed one of the few, if not the first, Tunisian provincial dignitary to be buried in an imperial mausoleum in Istanbul. Indeed, Hussein held major administrative position in Ottoman Tunisia. However, at that time, provincial Tunisian dignitaries, such as Hussein, would not be buried in Istanbul. Quite more often, they would be buried in Tunis, and mostly, if not in the major cemetery of Gelez in Tunis, or for people like Hussein, in a specific place, which is Turbat el Bey, which was the local mausoleum of the Tunisian governors since the 18th century in the historical center of Tunis. So in this presentation, I will argue that Hussein's case sheds light on Ottoman-specific interventions that historians have rarely explored, meaning the administrations of some Ottoman North African subjects' deaths and funerals in the central Mediterranean. And by doing so, the Ottoman Central Administration wanted to claim that North African Tunisian men and women were still an integral part of the Ottoman Empire at a very specific moment, 6 years after the French took over the former Ottoman province of Tunis. And while in a recent book entitled Imperial Bodies, Empire and Death in Alexandria, Shanna Minkin has explored European imperial and diplomatic strategies through the management of European burials in Egypt. In this presentation, I will argue that the Ottoman administration of burials across the Mediterranean, along with other evidences such as the organization of public funerals of other Tunisian statesmen, can clearly show that there was not any withdrawal from the Ottomans from North Africa, because often in the history of colonial North Africa, and mainly the history of colonial Tunisia, there is this idea that Ottomans were no longer interested by the case and the story or the history of North Africa, which was not at all the case. And here, I'm not the first one arguing that there was a renewed interest from the Ottomans for North Africa. This has been stated clearly in 1996 in this book by Andreas Zanetti, La communication entre Tunis et Istanbul. But this has been as well the concern of Zeynep Çelik's book about empire, architecture, and the city. And this has been part of a chapter about Khaireddin in Mediterraneans, the book written by Julia Clancy-Smith. And this is indeed at the center of Youssef Ben Smail's dissertation, Sovereignty Across Empires. So furthermore, I argue that exploring all the layers of this Ottoman burial politics would help us understanding how the specific political and cultural roots of burial politics became important even before the colonial period throughout North Africa. Because in a really inspiring chapters, as you see, I've really used the title. So in this chapter 5 of Mary Lewis' book, Mary Lewis argues that in the 1930s, Tunisian nationalists such as Habib Bourguiba used social and political conflicts around burials and cemeteries to define Tunisia as a Muslim nation. And at that time, Tunisian nationalists prevented other Tunisian citizens who had opted for French nationalization from being buried in Muslim cemeteries. So in this presentation, I will argue that this burial politics started to be shaped well before the colonial period, with the advent of colonialism in Algeria, for instance, in an era of sorrow and grief for North African Ottoman subjects who lost their sovereignty and became colonized subjects. My interest here for these overlaps between Ottoman imperial power and French colonial domination in North Africa is part of a broader argument that I made in my second book about the importance of Ottoman legacies in colonial Tunisia and about the crucial need to take into account such Ottoman legacies in order to reassess and to revise our understanding of the colonial period in North Africa. And I made this argument in a specific scholarly context in which still nowadays, scholars are studying North Africa mainly through the colonial lenses and building mainly on European colonial sources. So in the first section, which will be a short one, I'll speak for less than 20 minutes, I will explain how Ottoman authorities gained a specific expertise on burials and death management in the central Mediterranean between Italy and the Ottoman province of Tunis. And then in the second section, I will display the various forms of such Ottoman burial politics against the backdrop of a North African colonial context. So going back to the box, which traveled across the Mediterranean, on June 27, 1887, after Hussein passed away, the Ottoman consul in Florence, Basil Musuruzgikis, was the first diplomat to place seals on the body of Hussein and on the doors of Hussein's apartment in Florence. And the Ottoman consul, Musuruzgikis, was involved at that time in a fierce competition with the French consul in the same city of Florence, because the French authorities were, since the colonization of Tunisia, in charge of the interest of the Tunisian citizens abroad. In this competition, the Ottoman consul needed to act fast to claim the Ottoman authority over Hussein's body, but as well his belongings, before any further action from his French counterpart. In the coming days, after putting the seals on Hussein's body, Musuruzgikis had to hand over Hussein's mortal remains to the Ottoman vice consul in Livorno for burial in the Muslim cemetery. And Consul Musuruzgikis acted and won a first battle against his French counterpart for two main reasons. First, Ottoman authorities could rely on the very existence of a Muslim cemetery not that far from Florence in Livorno. And the Ottoman vice consul knew how to gather and to hire a specific staff of grave diggers stonemasons, and workers to build Hussein's grave. The Ottoman vice consul in Livorno also learned to adapt Muslim rituals to the new hygienic norms that were in force in this part of Europe by that time. But the Muslim cemetery of Livorno was related yet to another historical experience. Traders from Tripoli of Libya today, and officials from Algiers founded this cemetery around Livorno, outside of Livorno, in 1762. And this is an image that was in the paper of Mathieu Grenet about the foundation of this Muslim cemetery. In fact, traders and people from North Africa were interested by this place of Livorno because at that time there were diplomatic agreements between the Ottoman Empire and Tuscany to allow Muslims to settle in Livorno as well. And these Muslim experiences of burial in the late 18th century were revived by the mid-19th century when Ottoman statesmen and officials such as Hussein were sent to Europe on diplomatic missions. And when these men decided to settle in European countries, starting to be concerned about their own potential burials in Europe. And even someone like Hussein wrote letters when he was attending to other burials in London, for instance. But in addition to this local expertise, the Ottoman consul in Florence could rely on a coalition of Ottoman officials who were monitoring the case of Tunisia from Istanbul, including the burial of Hussein. One of these officials that Yusuf mentioned is indeed Khaireddin Basha, Khaireddin Tunisi, and Julia Clancy-Smith wrote a beautiful chapter in Mediterraneans about the case of Khaireddin. Khaireddin was, like Hussein, a slave who was born in the same region of Circassia, but Khaireddin went beyond in terms of political promotion. He was really more promoted than Hussein because Khaireddin became the wazir in Tunisia from 1873 to 1877, and then the vizier of the Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1878-1879. By controlling Hussein's burial, Khaireddin was not only aiming at retrieving Hussein's legacy, his real estate, and his official papers. He was perpetuating a long-standing Ottoman policy to defend the idea of a sovereignty over Tunisia through various means and political tools. So I will not go into details in terms of what were the techniques and the tools, but just to say that the case of Hussein is one of the many cases to express this idea that Tunisia was still Ottoman despite the fact that the French took over Tunisia. And the Ottoman officials knew that Hussein would unlikely be buried in Tunisia because Hussein was a staunch opponent to the French colonization of Tunisia by the French, And in an official report, the office of the Prime Minister in Istanbul, quote, argued that the deceased, Hussein, had made it openly known while alive that he wished to be buried in Istanbul, which was not clearly the case. So, except the case of Hussein, in fact, one can see that there is different evidences that there was a clear Ottoman choice of burying or choosing to honor the some Tunisian dignitaries. So the case of Hussein is interesting because, as I said, he was buried a second time in the mausoleum of Sultan Mahmud II. And Mahmud II is indeed known for having promoted a new type of army, trained and equipped along European lines, but as well for the implementation of different administrative reforms. And Hussein was himself deeply involved in the implementation of such administrative and military reforms in Tunisia. Not only was he the first mayor of Tunis, but he was the member of the Majlis al-Akbar, which was a kind of Supreme Court implemented in 1861 after the enactment of the Tunisian constitution, which is indeed the first constitution in the Muslim and the Arab world. As a matter of fact, the inscription in Ottoman Turkish on Hussein's grave in the mausoleum links Hussein to the Ottoman state reforms, mentioning, for instance, his appointment to the Ottoman Council of State. And this is something that has been published by Beke Gramont and Tibet in this book about cemeteries and traditions in funerary traditions in the Ottoman Empire. But Ottoman involvement went beyond the relocation of a Tunisian subject to a dynastic building, exalting the main actors of the reform across the empire. It's interesting to note as well that there were public funerals for former Tunisian officials and scholars, individuals who took part in the funerals of Ottoman Tunisians might have expressed a sense of Muslim solidarity, underlining the ties binding Tunisian North African subjects to the populations and lands of Islam. Although I didn't find any description of Hussein's second funeral in Istanbul, we know that during the same period, in 1889, in Cairo, for instance, a sad and sweeping crowd followed the funeral of a friend of Hussein, Mohammed Bayram al-Khamis, who was a major Islamic scholar who left Tunis after the French colonization of his country. The following year, in 1890, again, Khaireddin Basha was buried in the Ayyub Mosque, where other Ottoman dignitaries were buried. And this is indeed not a coincidence. And there was this sense that not only Ottomans were organizing this kind of public funerals, but even in the newspapers, there was some obituaries for these former Tunisian dignitaries who chose to live in Cairo and Istanbul. For the case of Hussein, we know that Mohammed Bayram al-Khamis himself wrote an obituary about Hussein, which was entitled National Tragedy. I mean, I don't know if we should say national, but at least it was Fajia al-Wataniya, which was a sense of describing Hussein as a main champion of Islam and as a main reformer of Tunisia. So I will not go into detail about what Bayram Khamis was saying about Hussein, but it's interesting that Bayram Khamis insisted on the fact that Hussein was committed to defend the Muslims and as well to promote the education of Tunisians by the 1870s. Bayram's article made no reference at all to Hussein's settling in Italy and living in Italy and having a lover as well in Italy. It simply stated that Hussein was traveling between Italy, France, and England, and that he never missed a prayer in a mosque wherever he went. So to conclude, in her book, Divided Rule, historian Mary Lewis has brilliantly shown to what extent Tunisian nationalists used social and political conflicts around burials and cemeteries to define Tunisia as a Muslim nation in the early 1930s. But well before the interwar period, in the mid-1880s, in addition to the Ottoman burial politics, issues surrounding cemeteries triggered other political demonstrations in Tunis. For instance, in 1885, a member of Hussein's entourage, Muslim scholar Mohammed Sanusi, drew up a petition in reaction to new French regulations on burying the dead. And 2 years later, in 1887, Jewish families protested as French authorities decided to close the old Jewish cemetery in northern Tunis and to convert the land in public use. And so these two protests did not result in major political mobilization in Tunisia, like in the 1930s. However, they clearly showcase that cemeteries were sensitive, contentious places for identity politics in colonized Tunisia. And I assume that there were underground connections between these local mobilizations, the burial politics across the Ottoman Empire, and the national politics in Tunisian cemeteries from the 1930s. And just to conclude, it's interesting to note that the remains of Khaireddin were brought back from Istanbul to Tunisia in the 1960s by Bourguiba. And so there is this kind of underground connection about cemeteries, burials, and this notion of burial politics. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint, but my two colleagues have provided such wonderful images that this sort of makes up for my lack of illustrations. So much gratitude to all of you and to the Sabancı Center, which has forged an Ottoman Empire whose geographical sprawl is many times greater than Suleiman's 16th century realms. If you think about it, we're now having conversations from Istanbul, Tunis to Paris, New York, and the Southwest adjacent to the Mexican border. So I'll just briefly locate Tunisia in my remarks vis-a-vis the political center, and subsequently I'll reflect on my colleagues' splendid papers. So as we all know, until recently, the gaze of modern Ottoman historians, and I would sort of emphasize modern, entered into geohistorical eclipse somewhere around Egypt and Cyrenaica. How many times at conferences have we all heard the following? The empire stretched from Eastern Europe and the Balkans to Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Hejaz, and the Red Sea, end of quote. When that gaze continued further west, it focused on Algeria, which, like Egypt, was and is big and noisy. See, the kinds of imperial provinces that historians unwittingly prefer. Smaller states such as Tunisia seem less appealing, not quite Ottoman, nor Euro-Mediterranean, nor African. This despite the fact that Tunisian historians were the first to fully acknowledge the Ottoman past, issuing pleas for research in not only the Beylikal or colonial archives, but also in those archives on the shores of the Bosphorus. And here I reference the Foundation Abdel Jalil Temimi in Tunis, which since the 1970s has nurtured collaboration between Arab and Turkish scholars and others to recuperate the longue durée Ottoman legacy in the Maghreb. But our concern today is mainly something called the modern. With France's conquest of Algeria from 1830 on, the Beylik of Tunis became the port's most distant African possession. A critical one indeed, because it guarded access to the central Mediterranean corridor. As every savvy Ottoman admiral or seaman knew, Tunisia lay astride islands big and small, as well as currents and winds that dictated navigational success or disaster. Paradoxically, perhaps, the consolidation of the Hussein dynasty meant that the connective sinews between Istanbul and Tunis thickened even before 1830. Subsequently, those sinews multiplied because of the menacing colonial state in the making to the west. And they multiplied also because of the restored and renewed Ottoman presence in Tripolitania after 1835. During the tense French naval blockade of Algiers from 1827 on, and it lasted for 3 years, Ottoman ships and envoys put into Tunis port with greater frequency. It seems that the Sultan sought to mediate the Franco-Algerian dispute, using Tunisia as a base. ultimately, Tunisia became a refuge for Algerians seeking French military pacification, and many haven seekers remained in the Beylik, although others pressed on and sought protection in the Mashriq, in the imperial center. During the summer of 1881, as alarming rumors circulated about the French army crossing the Algerian-Tunisian frontiers in the north, city inhabitants hastened to the port, Halkilwadi or La Goletta, hoping to espy an Ottoman squadron on the horizon. After 1881, Tunisia became a demographic pump and mixing bowl, moving people and things circum the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean. And of course, this is true before. Thus, transversal and institutionalized relations between Tunisia and the imperial core come into view more clearly. This constitutes a needed corrective, I would argue, to the overemphasis upon north-south trans-sea exchanges from 1830 on. The perspective also that is transversal also reveals decades of border making negotiations involving the French in Algeria, the Husseynids, and the Ottomans along Tunisia's western and eastern frontiers until Italy's invasion. After October 1911, Ottoman officers and combatants, in numbers larger than conventionally reported, disembarked from Tunisian ports to gain Tripoli and fight against the Italian army, although of course many traveled from Egypt. An essential bond between the beys of Tunis and their Ottoman overlords was the provision of Mamluks, so brilliantly studied by Muhammad, by Professor Waldi, and also by Yusuf, was the provision of Mamluks for military, civil, and household service. Khaireddin Pasha has made several appearances in our papers. Also a Circassian, as was noted by Professor Wilde, and the same generation as Hussein ibn Abdullah. Khaireddin was dispatched from Istanbul to the Husseinid court around 1840, where he spent decades serving in multiple state functions. In 1878, he was recalled by Abdul Hamid to serve somewhat fleetingly as prime minister. In Khaireddin's worldview, his decades in Tunisia had rendered him a local, which is what Professor Ben Ismail was discussing so brilliantly. Hélas, France's 1881 invasion of his adopted homeland dashed hopes of return. When Khaireddin died in 1890, as we were just informed, he was laid to rest in the Ayyub Mosque Cemetery, the oldest in Istanbul. And also, as Professor Wilde pointed out, in 1968, that is 12 years after independence, Khaireddin's remains were repatriated, ostensibly to celebrate the centennial publication of his masterful treatise, Aqwam al-Masalik, although, as Professor Wilde suggested, and as he knows, other agendas were also at play. Today, Khaireddin's former palace, adjacent to the Medina, houses the capital city's municipal museum. So, by way of conclusions, before addressing the papers, by citing our inquiry in this place and time, the transversal axes from the central Maghreb across Africa, which I would argue is greater Tunisia, we can get back to that, to Istanbul emerge as more rather than less critical in the modern era. The entire Tunisian coast from Tabarka to Jerba, and if we're going to follow my argument regarding Greater Tunisia, we could also include Jijali to Annaba. That coastline represented fluid yet critical sea and land contact points. Their significance to Ottoman geostrategic calculations has at times gone missing under the historian's radar, but constituted an acknowledged reality for those in power, judging by the evidence. Reconceptualizing the Ottoman Empire from Tunisia advances theories and methodologies of imperialism, or maybe imperialisms in the plural. For example, the 18th century Tunisian history exposes the torque of what historians of empire have called sub-imperialisms, during triangular struggles. Under the Porte's imperial umbrella, the regimes of the Deys and the Beys and Algiers and Tunis fought each other for control of Greater Tunisia or Ifriqiya into the early 19th century. Tunisia may not have been as noisy and big as Egypt, but the country offers historical insights into deep-moving yet enduring processes that our two papers uncover. So the restless dead is the subject of Professor Wilde's research. He argues persuasively against the notion of an Ottoman retreat from North African affairs in the 19th century. In doing so, Professor Wilde's paper makes a significant contribution to a growing field of what I would call necrology studies. Exhumations are not new to Mediterranean politics. In the late 10th century, the Shia Fatimid dynasty abandoned their capital in Tunisia for Cairo, bearing the coffins of their ancestors with them. In Weldy's compelling narrative, even trifling events like the reburial of an Ottoman notable in 1887, or a seemingly irrelevant firman, hold layers of meaning for the topic at hand. Regarding the latter, this firman, issued in 1882, legitimized Ali Bey's investiture, as significantly, talks dragged on between the Tunisian state and occupying French forces. The Convention of La Marsa of June 1883, establishing the protectorate, came later. There was no reason why in 1882, when this firman was issued, that the Porte would passively accept as fait accompli that Tunisia would irrevocably fall under France's authority. Nevertheless, historians tend to fall into the teleological snare. As for the reburial of Hussein, apparently to respect his last wishes, Weldy skillfully deploys other subtle and multiple readings. That the Muslim world's most influential ruler extended protection to the departed renders visible the fact that North African provinces, notables, and beings, human beings, even those claimed by European power, mattered. Moreover, Hussein's casket was marked antiquities, which I find absolutely fascinating. This too is significant, explaining how it traveled from Marseille to Istanbul with apparent ease. By this period, looted antiquities increasingly moved around the Mediterranean, but they usually moved from east to west. So we're seeing here west to east. And along with those boxes or caskets, dense circuits of monies and debts and other things circulated. Finally, or not finally, from the indisputable sovereignty of death, we move back in time 13 years to a Tunisia in which no one really knew what lay ahead. Professor Ben Ismail's paper opens in 1874 as yet another Algerian question provoked alarm over jurisdictional issues, allegiances, alliances, and identities. Perhaps inspired by the 1870 Crémieux law, forcibly naturalizing the vast majority of Algerian Jews, the 1874 decree may have been drawn up in part as an insurance policy. However, Professor Ben Ismail's contribution does not stop there. He is not content with that kind of argument. He brilliantly recreates categories of subjecthood at a specific historical juncture in order to argue that scholars need to reconceptualize regimes of belonging without recourse to European archetypes of nationality and citizenship. What his paper is making a case for so compellingly is the sort of the simultaneous nature, yet mutable nature, simultaneous nature of belonging to the empire. So it could be simultaneously, yet simultaneous sovereignties that are simultaneous, yet also mutable in terms of belonging to the empire, within overlapping and overarching imperial structures. This once again characterized Ottoman relationships with Tunisian, of course, they evolved over time. Once again, this research lays bare profound realities about the transversal Maghreb and the regions of importance, particularly Tunisia's, to the Ottoman Empire until that empire was no more. Through Ben Ismail's work, we also grasp the perils and promise of translations in many senses of the term, and he avoids the teleological trap. His notion of administrer is particularly original. As a postscript and aside, and because France has been invoked, I can't restrain myself from pointing this out. France, in the 21st century French Republic, has recently undertaken a series of exhumations of famous women to achieve gender parity at that bastion of male privilege, the Panthéon. So more necrology studies await us. Finally, much gratitude to you all, to the Sabanjeu Center, presenters, organizers, and audience for launching conversations that are sure to endure. Thank you. Okay, and I guess now our audience is on stage. All right, good.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Clancy-Smith, for your wonderful comments, as well as our wonderful presenters for their excellent papers. If any of our panelists has anything to say to Professor Clancy-Smith, maybe it's the time to hear your thoughts. But before that, let me remind our audience that if you have particular questions to our panelists, please post them on the Q&A box. We already have a couple of questions, but we still have time. So please don't hesitate to address your questions on the Q&A box. Okay, Dr. Ben Ismail or Professor Waldi, do you have anything to add to Professor Clancy-Smith's comments?
Yes, maybe quickly, because for the sake of hearing some questions from the audience. No, thank you so much, Professor Clancy-Smith, for these comments. Just to say, and this is something that Professor Clancy-Smith pointed out, there are new studies about North African subjects within the Ottoman Empire during the colonial period. So I should mention the work of Nourdin Amara about Algerian subject, which is a fascinating study, but as well Salma Hargal work about Algerians as well in the Middle East. So I think there is a new trend, and of some people who, know Ottoman Turkish besides Arabic, which is not my case indeed. So I think it's really going in a good direction. And as you said, Julia Clancy-Smith, Temimi was a pioneer in the field. In a moment when in Tunisia it was all about the building, how the nation state was shaped and what was the story of this nation state. So hopefully there will be a new understanding of Ottoman Tunisia and Ottoman Algeria as well.
Not much to add on my part, except to thank Professor Clancy-Smith for highlighting really the fact that the study of Ottoman Tunis is not only historically significant for Ottoman studies, but also conceptually productive. And I think this is a key point that she highlights in her work and that she brought up in her response, and I thank her for that.
Let me address the first question that I see in the Q&A box raised by Luke Scalone. And this is a question to you, Yusuf. Have you seen the use of himaya at all in later contexts, perhaps after the establishment of the proctorate, or does it fall entirely out of use in favor of jenseya?
Thank you for this very rich question. The particularity of himaya. There are other concepts of legal belonging circulating in the Ottoman Empire, tabi'iyet, riayet, and so on. But in the Tunisian context, the concept of protection has other meanings, obviously, that emerge after 1881, when the particular kind of colonial domination that takes place in Tunis is called the protectorate. And so himaya becomes also a translation for the jurisdictional, but also, sovereign territorial authority of the French colonial power in Tunisia. And that meaning of the term himaya in Arabic, right, gradually replaces the quote unquote local indigenous category of belonging. It continues to be in use. In my experience, I've seen it in documents after 1881 to refer to the authority of the Bey, but especially in the 20th century, jenseya takes over. And obviously, as I tried to suggest, that has political implications for the French, because it's very important for the French state to make the now colonized Bey's polity look as sovereign as possible. And so when in 1914, a Tunisian jenseya or nationality law is passed, they make sure that that term fully replaces other categories of legal belonging in legal texts, since they have full authority in what is now their colonial territory. So gradually it fades out, not in terms of it appearing in the sources, but what fades out really is it's this context, right? The Ottoman imperial context, the fact that it's a category that refers to the jurisdictional authority of the Bey locally and so on, and other colonial meanings become attached to it, which in and of itself is an interesting evolution.
There is this question from Linda Belabdelo Hab Farnini, and I think this is addressed to both of you. Could you please expand on the relationship between the Dey of Algiers and the Bey of Algiers and Bey of Tunis? I mean, how did they cooperate, for instance? How similar or different was their behavior toward the Sublime Porte?
Yes, maybe Julia want to jump in. I mean, not to offend the Algerians in the audience, because I will never offend Algerians in the audience. No, in fact, there was a competition between the Tunisian governors and the Deys of Algiers, and the power in Algiers. I mean, they represented themselves as the legitimate province of the Ottoman province in North Africa, because they were the first becoming Ottoman in the region. And to my knowledge, Tunisia has been invaded twice by the Algerian troops. And there was as well a treaty between the Ottoman province of Tunis and the Ottoman province of Algiers, drawing the first borders between the two countries by the 17th century and then the beginning of the 19th century. So this is a story of competition, and as Julia Clancy-Smith, I mean, she used this concept, which is really relevant, of sub-imperialism in North Africa. So yeah, clearly it's much more a story of competition than solidarity between the two provinces, clearly. And to the point that in 1833 or 1834, there was this idea that the Ottoman governors of Tunis would be in charge of some parts of the former Ottoman province of Algiers, collaborating with the French. This is a story that Tunisians are not really proud of, but someone should at least tell the story of this moment in 1834, which didn't last, when the Tunisians were about to manage some parts of the former Ottoman province of Algiers. Julia or Youssef on these issues, maybe?
I think you said it all. I can take the next question, which seems addressed to me, about jenseya. I just want to make sure we have time to, because I see many interesting questions.
Yes, absolutely. We have more time, and you can also, I suppose, see the questions, so you can pick whatever question you would like to address.
Just in order,
Yeah.
I see Tun Shan Okan's question about the relationship between the term jenseya and tabiiyet in the Ottoman Empire, in the Ottoman context, and whether the term jenseya ever had widespread currency in the late Ottoman Empire. And I can speak to that a little bit. The Ottoman Empire drafts a nationality law in 1869, which is very early for nationality laws. The French nationality law is later, 2 decades later or so. And in this law, the term for nationality is tabiiyet, right? And the nationals are called tebea in Ottoman Turkish, starting around this period. And so, sort of in the broader chapter that this research is taken from, what I try to say is that the Tunisians are tebea of the Sultan and mahmis of the Bey, right? And so this is the duality. So it's more that term than the term jenseya that becomes prevalent in Ottoman Turkish. Some Ottoman Turkish dictionaries will include jenseya as nationality, even in Ottoman dictionaries, but it's tabiiyet that becomes the prevalent term for it. In the Ottoman Arab provinces, jenseya does become the Arabic term for tabiiyet and therefore nationality, right? And here, the work of Will Hanley is particularly useful. He's a historian of Ottoman Egypt, to understand how these categories evolve, especially later on in colonial context, and in the 1880s and so on. And he writes about sort of tabiiyet as nationality, and how that category emerges and what the social and political implications are for it.
The next question is to you two again, I believe, Yusuf. Faisal Abu Al Hassan question.
I'll read it because I haven't read it yet. During the period of the French protectorate, prior to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, how was subjecthood of Tunisian Muslim administration understood by the beylical administration outside of Tunis? For example, Tunisian administrators in Morocco, a non-Ottoman space, or in Egypt and the Hejaz, varying levels of Ottoman titular suzerainty. It's an excellent question, and I haven't studied Morocco well. I know more about how they were treated within the Ottoman realm, meaning the realm that was under the direct authority of Istanbul, and there unambiguously, after 1881, the Ottoman government considers Tunisians ordinary Ottoman subjects, and the Bey of Tunis never complains. Now, of course, the Bey of Tunis after 1881 essentially becomes a mouthpiece, gradually becomes a mouthpiece for the French colonial administration. And the French do protest a great deal against the way that the Ottomans treat Tunisians outside of Tunis, under their purview as regular Ottoman subjects. But this becomes sort of a focal point of Ottoman resistance against the French protectorate. And so the Ottomans really never stopped treating Tunisians on their territory, including in Egypt and elsewhere, as local subjects, as Ottoman nationals. This stops essentially when the Ottoman Empire, essentially after World War I, actually. Even in World War I, Tunisians, the Ottoman Empire, are considered Ottoman subjects. In Morocco and elsewhere, most of the time, it's a version of Tunisian subjecthood. That is the primary way that these Tunisian emigres are considered. They're considered to be under the authority of the Bey, and the Tunisian government does have representatives abroad that take care of the interests of these Tunisians. but it's a messy situation. So sometimes Tunisians also go and talk to the Ottoman consul when there is one. And of course, this becomes increasingly politicized. I don't want to say too much and go on for too long, but and the French also protest against this every time an Ottoman diplomat steps in, right? So there is no clarity. I mean, also we should refrain from sort of establishing models that are too rigid here, because I think there is great confusion on the ground during this period.
Okay, I am reading Ettore Chiora's question. Ettore Chiora is a PhD student in Italy, and his question is rather broad, and it is to Professor Waldi. He is wondering whether you could comment on the relationship of General Hussein and Mohammed Behram V with Italy. A certain French historiography has long pointed to them as being pro-Italian, he says, but as the case just presented of the burials shows, they actually pursued their own point of view linked more to the Regency of Tunis and the Ottoman Empire. So, in what proportion, in your opinion, was the relationship with Italy functional to the pursuit of their own political agenda? Now, this is where it gets really broad. Which other factors were involved? How was this relationship with Italy seen in Istanbul? We're giving you 3 hours, Mohammed, so go
No,
ahead.
I'll be really brief. I mean, we should not believe the French, even if I'm French. No, I'm joking here. But no, I mean, Hussein went to Italy because for a specific reason. I mean, he was in charge of defending the Tunisian interest in a specific legal case about the will of a former Tunisian subject, Nassim Shamama. And there is a book about to be published by Jessica Marlin about this case. So it was much more because Italy is this place, and mostly Tuscany is this place where you have this kind of Tunisian Jewish interests, and Hussein was involved. And he stayed there for a decade. Who wouldn't stay in Tuscany for a decade? I mean, I would, for different reasons, and he had to raise 2 kids there. But I don't think that Hussein was in favor of the Italian interest at all, neither Bayram Khamis. There were some interest in staying there because they could use some legal tools, or they would defend Tunisian interests in Italy. So that would be my reply to Ettore Chiora. So, but if Ettore finds some evidences of some Tunisian interests in Italy related to the Rubattino company, that would be as well interesting. So less than 3 hours, Zeynep.
Very good, thank you. The next question is to Professor Bad Ismail. You partly answered this question, I believe. Do we know what the French reaction was to the differences of terminology between the printed and handwritten document that you pointed out? Was there any Ottoman central government legal reaction to the same difference?
So for the Ottoman side, no, because they were never aware this was a private correspondence. And the Tunisian state, especially when Khaireddin is prime minister, is really very good at presenting itself as independent to please the French in the private correspondences, and then presenting itself as a very ordinary province of the empire, of the Ottoman Empire, when addressing the Sultan or the Porte. So this is a case of that, and as a result, and it's somewhat characteristic of this triangular relationship, neither the French nor the Ottomans have anything to say in reaction to those differences. And my sense is that the Ottomans didn't notice it, and the French didn't care enough to point it out.
There is another very broad question by Sylvia Marston-Sackley. How do you in your sources conceive the Ottomans at this time? Is it as a national, like Ottomanism, or religio-national category? that is as representative of all Muslims while still functioning as a caliphate? So Yusuf, maybe this is a question more.
It's a broad question, but what I'll say about it is that the idea of how can I say, the idea of a political category of Ottomanness and of a religious category on the other hand of a caliphate, as an either or dichotomy, I think doesn't really get at the fact that for the people experiencing this rule, or indeed for the people theorizing it in the Ottoman central government, those weren't entirely separate, right? So the power of the Sultan as a caliph was inseparable from his temporal authority as a sovereign. And so it's an equally broad answer to a broad question, but I think that once we begin to think about Ottoman belonging and authority from this standpoint, we get more nuanced answers to that question. So I don't know what else to say except that for Tunisians, being under the authority of an Ottoman caliph also had sovereign implications. Maybe Mohammed wants to add, or Julia.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, it's the elephant in the room, clearly, because it's about Islam and Islamic identity. So it has an emic category that would depend indeed on the people using this category. But what I saw in Hussein's letters is that indeed for him, it was not about being Ottoman, but being a Muslim and being part of an Islamic ummah, which was defended by the Sultan. So, and clearly, and this is something that Yusuf underlined, this is political and religious at the same time, so you cannot dissociate that. So, but Sylvia's question is an important one. It could be a part of a conversation between different people using different sources. Thank you so much.
A question which expands the geography even further, and it may be important to think about it for a moment. Ibn Haydar passage says, at roughly the same time as Tunisia, Habsburgs occupied Ottoman Bosnia and Bulgaria obtained a semi-sovereign status. Did Tunisian actors use these Balkan parallels in their discourse? Did any Ottoman institutions try to pull these semi-sovereign former Ottoman spaces into same legal space, or were they largely separate? To both of you. And
I'll just say very quickly and very concretely that this is an important question, and that in Ottoman documents from the Ottoman state archives in Istanbul, not systematically, but almost systematically, almost in all of them, when the so-called Tunisian question is concerned, when the question of the sovereign status of the Tunisian state and its Ottomanness comes into discussion, usually it is discussed alongside a number of autonomous territories, including Balkan territories, including Egypt, including some Greek polities, which is really exciting for historians who care about this question of Tunisian belonging in the Ottoman Empire, because it points to the fact that and this is I think what the question suggests, from the point of view of the Ottoman state, this wasn't a provincial or distant question. This was a question, these were issues that seemed to be broader, to be coming from European imperialism perhaps, or perhaps the rise of independentist movements throughout the empire rather than a localized North African issue. And the question of what it means for an Ottoman territory to be semi-sovereign or autonomous really is a cross-provincial issue. It's an imperial issue that Istanbul sees, I think, as such. This is my experience from reading these documents in Istanbul, at least.
Can I also ask something as an early modernist? Yusuf, I know that you are as comfortable with early modern sources as you are with 19th century sources. My question is, how far back can you trace the notion of jenseya or jins in the legal or political parlance of the early modern or modern times? I mean, when I was listening to your wonderful presentation, I kept thinking of Metin Kuntz's really influential article on ethnic regional solidarity in the 17th century Ottoman context, which was defined particularly with reference to the notion of jins. So I wonder whether there might be any connection at all or any continuity in terms of the use of jins or jinsi as a category.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Tun, for I wasn't familiar with that reference, and in the sources that I've looked at, it is really a modern category. So 17th, 18th century, it's riayet or riaya in Arabic, himayet, right? Idare is another thing that is transferred, another power, another authority that is transferred from Istanbul to Tunis. And so the vocabulary of autonomy is very rich, but jins or jinsiyet as a legal political category, right, of solidarity, of provincial authority, I've only seen it really emerge in the 1860s, perhaps the 1850s. But I'll look at the work you suggest. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your fantastic contributions to Ottoman history. And I'm thinking on every level, this has been a wonderful session, empirically, methodologically, theoretically, and we're very, very grateful to all of you for accepting our invitation, and we'll continue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel, to Zeynep and to Tunç.
Well, thank you all. I mean, we are running out of time. That's why we can't address each and every question raised in the Q&A box. Sorry about that. But we are hoping that we will have more events like this to expand the horizons of Ottoman and Turkish studies. Thank you, and
thank you.
Yeah, we hope
You
have a good rest of the day. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ciao.